The autumn breeze swept through the quiet streets of downtown Riverside as Rebecca Johnson stepped out of her high school's main entrance. Her debate team practice had run longer than usual, but the 16-year-old didn't mind. As the team captain, she took pride in helping her fellow students perfect their arguments for the upcoming state championships. Rebecca checked her phone, 4:45 p.m. She had enough time to stop at Marlowe's, the upscale boutique her friend Sarah had been raving about. The store had just received its fall collection, and Rebecca wanted to use some of her savings from her weekend tutoring job to buy something special for her upcoming birthday dinner. The brass bell chimed softly as she pushed open the heavy glass door. The boutique smelled of vanilla and new fabric, with soft classical music playing in the background. Rebecca noticed immediately how the elderly white woman behind the counter tensed up, her eyes following Rebecca's every move. It wasn't an unfamiliar reaction. Being one of the few black students at Riverside Prep had taught her to recognize these subtle signs of prejudice. Officers Mike Sullivan and James Cooper were parked across the street, taking their usual break at the local coffee shop. Through the large windows, they spotted Rebecca entering the boutique. Officer Sullivan nudged his partner, raising an eyebrow. "Looks like trouble," he muttered, setting down his coffee cup. Inside, Rebecca browsed through the racks of clothing, admiring the soft sweaters and elegant blazers. She selected a deep purple cardigan, checking the price tag and doing quick mental math. A group of teenage girls entered the store, laughing and chatting loudly. Among them was Emily Parker, a classmate known for her mean girl attitude and wealthy parents. The store clerk immediately rushed to assist Emily's group, leaving Rebecca to continue shopping alone. She didn't notice Emily watching her with narrowed eyes, nor did she see when Emily slipped behind the same rack she was browsing. Rebecca was too focused on finding the right size of the cardigan she'd chosen. Officers Sullivan and Cooper had made their way into the store, positioning themselves near the entrance. They watched Rebecca intently, ignoring the rowdy behavior of Emily's group. The tension in the air grew thicker, but Rebecca remained absorbed in her shopping, unaware of the drama about to unfold. After finding the right size, Rebecca headed to the fitting room. The clerk reluctantly handed her a number tag, making sure to count the items she took in. In the small changing room, Rebecca tried on the cardigan, admiring how perfectly it fit. She took a quick selfie to send to her mother, Judge Patricia Johnson, who was in court that afternoon presiding over a high-profile case. As Rebecca left the fitting room, Emily and her friends were gathering their purchases at the counter. Rebecca noticed Emily smirking at her but thought nothing of it. She decided to buy the cardigan and made her way to the register, waiting patiently behind the group of girls. Just as Emily's group exited the store, the security alarm suddenly blared. Rebecca froze, confused. The clerk's eyes immediately locked onto her, and before she could process what was happening, Officers Sullivan and Cooper approached her with stern expressions. "Don't move," Officer Sullivan commanded, his hand resting on his belt. "Empty your bag." Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she opened her backpack. "There must be a mistake," she said calmly, despite her racing heart. "I haven't taken anything." Officer Cooper roughly grabbed her backpack, dumping its contents onto the counter. Among her school books and debate notes tumbled out an expensive silk scarf, one Rebecca had never seen before. Her eyes widened in shock. Well, what do we have here?" Officer Sullivan's voice dripped with satisfaction. "Looks like we caught ourselves a shoplifter." "That's not mine," Rebecca protested, maintaining her composure despite the humiliation. "I've never seen that scarf before. Please, check the security cameras." "They'd all say that." Officer Cooper sneered, pulling out his handcuffs. "Put your hands behind your back." The store clerk watched with a mixture of smugness and discomfort as the officers began to handcuff Rebecca. Through the store window, Emily and her friends could be seen watching the scene unfold, trying to suppress their giggles. Rebecca took a deep breath, remembering her mother's advice about staying calm in difficult situations. "I'd like to make a phone call," she stated firmly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to form in her eyes. "It's my right." Little did the officers know that their actions that afternoon would soon spiral into something much bigger than a simple shoplifting case. As they led Rebecca out of the store, neither suspected they were about to learn a harsh lesson about prejudice, power, and justice. The police cruiser's back seat felt cold and hard as Rebecca sat with her hands cuffed behind her back. Through the window, she could see curious onlookers gathering outside Marlowe's boutique, their phones raised to capture her humiliation. Officer Sullivan was speaking into his radio, while Officer Cooper stood guard by the car door, his stance rigid and intimidating. "Dispatch, we got a 459 in custody," Sullivan reported, using the code for shoplifting. Young female, apprehended at Marlowe's boutique on Madison Avenue. Inside the store, the clerk was filling out an incident report, her earlier nervousness replaced by self-righteousness. She detailed how she'd known something was off about Rebecca from the moment she walked in, carefully avoiding any mention of her own biased behavior. Rebecca watched as Emily Parker and her friends lingered nearby, pretending to be interested in their phones while stealing glances at the scene. Emily's satisfied smirk told Rebecca everything she needed to know about the mysterious scarf that had appeared in her backpack. "Please." Rebecca tried again, her voice steady despite her growing anxiety. "If you just check the security cameras, you'll see I didn't take anything. That scarf was planted in my bag." Officer Sullivan turned around sharply. "Listen here, young lady. We've heard every excuse in the book. Save your stories for the judge." The irony of his statement would have made Rebecca laugh if the situation wasn't so serious. Instead, she focused on remembering every detail of what was happening. The officers' badge numbers, their exact words, the witnesses present. Her mother had always taught her the importance of documentation in cases of injustice. The store manager, Mr. Peterson, arrived just then, having been called by the clerk. He was a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. "Officers, perhaps we should review the security footage before." "We caught her red-handed." Officer Cooper interrupted. "The evidence is clear. No need to waste your time with videos." Mr. Peterson hesitated, glancing between Rebecca and the officers. His mouth opened as if to speak again, but he quickly closed it when Officer Sullivan shot him a stern look. Meanwhile, inside the store, another customer, an elderly black woman named Mrs. Watson, was quietly recording the scene on her phone. She had witnessed Emily's suspicious behavior earlier, but had been too far away to intervene. Now she was making sure to capture every interaction between the officers and Rebecca. "We're taking her down to the station," Officer Sullivan announced, reaching for the driver's door. "You can pick up your stolen merchandise at the precinct after filing charges." Rebecca took a deep breath, remembering the constitutional rights her mother had drilled into her head since childhood. "I do not consent to any searches," she stated clearly. "I want to call my parent, and I want to speak to a lawyer." Both officers exchanged knowing looks, chuckling. "Watch out, Cooper," Sullivan joked. "Looks like we got a junior law expert here. Probably learned everything from TV shows." The cruiser's engine roared to life, and Rebecca felt her heart rate increase. She knew her mother was in court and wouldn't see any messages for at least another hour. The thought of sitting in a holding cell until then made her stomach churn, but she maintained her composure. As they pulled away from the curb, Rebecca caught one last glimpse of Emily Parker's group. They were laughing now, probably congratulating themselves on their cruel prank. What they didn't know was that their actions would soon have consequences far beyond what they imagined. Mrs. Watson quickly wrote down the police cruiser's number before hurrying to her car. She had recognized Rebecca from the newspaper photos of Judge Johnson's swearing-in ceremony last year. This wasn't going to end well for those officers, she thought, already planning to contact the judge's chambers. The drive to the police station was tense and silent. Officer Sullivan drove while Cooper filled out preliminary paperwork, neither of them paying attention to their young suspect's calm demeanor. They had no idea that with each passing minute, they were digging themselves deeper into a situation that would soon expose their prejudices and misconduct to the entire city. As the police station came into view, Rebecca straightened her shoulders. She might be in handcuffs now, but she knew this story was far from over. Her mother had taught her that justice, though sometimes delayed, was always worth fighting for. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the police station as Officers Sullivan and Cooper led Rebecca through the building. The teenage girl kept her head high despite the stares from other officers and staff members. Her school uniform and debate team pin stood in stark contrast to the usual suspects brought through these halls. "Name?" barked Officer Sullivan as they reached the processing desk. "Rebecca Marie Johnson," she replied clearly, keeping her voice steady. The desk sergeant, A middle-aged woman named Officer Martinez began typing the information into her computer. Age? 16. Officer Cooper snickered. Old enough to know better than to steal, wouldn't you say? Rebecca remained silent, remembering her mother's advice about not engaging with provocative comments from law enforcement. Officer Martinez glanced up from her computer screen, a slight frown crossing her face as she observed the interaction. Address? Sullivan continued. 4875 Oakwood Drive, Riverside Heights. Both officers paused for a moment, exchanging glances. Riverside Heights was the city's most prestigious neighborhood, home to doctors, lawyers, and city officials. Before they could process this information, Officer Martinez spoke up. "You're entitled to one phone call," she said, her tone notably more professional than her colleagues. "Would you like to make it now?" Rebecca nodded. "Yes, please." Sullivan led her to a wall-mounted phone, removing one handcuff so she could dial. "Make it quick," he warned, "and don't try anything funny." With steady fingers, Rebecca dialed her mother's private chamber number. She knew the court session should be ending soon. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. Judge Johnson's chambers. "Ms. Roberts, this is Rebecca. Is my mother available? It's urgent." There was a pause on the other end. "The judge is just wrapping up her last case. Let me transfer you to the courtroom." Officer Sullivan tapped his foot impatiently as Rebecca waited. In the background, she could hear Cooper joking with another officer about rich kids thinking they're above the law. Finally, her mother's voice came through the line. "Rebecca, what's wrong?" Taking a deep breath, Rebecca spoke clearly and calmly. "Mom, I'm at the Central Police Station. I've been arrested for allegedly shoplifting at Marlowe's boutique. The officers refused to check security footage and—" "Which officers?" Judge Patricia Johnson's voice was eerily calm. "Officers Sullivan and Cooper. Badge numbers 4479 and 4832. Sullivan's face darkened as he heard Rebecca reciting their badge numbers. He reached for the phone. "Time's up." "Mom, they're ending my call. I'm in booking and—" The line went dead as Sullivan slammed the receiver down. "All right, enough with the dramatics. Let's get your fingerprints done." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The station's front doors swung open, and Ms. Roberts, Judge Johnson's clerk, strode in purposefully. The young woman carried a leather briefcase and wore an expression that made several officers straighten their posture instinctively. "I'm here on behalf of Judge Johnson," she announced clearly. "No fingerprinting or processing is to begin until Her Honor arrives." "Which officers are Sullivan and Cooper?" The 2 officers who had been so confident moments ago now stood frozen. Officer Martinez quickly pulled up the arrest report on her screen, her expression growing increasingly concerned as she read. Rebecca watched as Ms. Roberts began taking notes, documenting everything from the officers' positions to the time displayed on the wall clock. In law school, she had been Judge Johnson's star pupil, and now she was one of the most feared legal minds in the district attorney's office. "Judge Johnson?" Officer Cooper's voice cracked slightly. As in the Honorable Patricia Johnson, Chief Justice of the District Court," Ms. Roberts confirmed coldly. "Who, I might add, is currently ending a session where she just sentenced 3 officers for civil rights violations." The atmosphere in the station shifted dramatically. Other officers began finding reasons to be elsewhere, while Sullivan and Cooper stood rooted to the spot, their earlier bravado evaporating. Rebecca sat quietly in a nearby chair, no longer handcuffed, watching as Ms. Roberts efficiently documented every detail of her illegal detention. She could already hear the approaching clicks of her mother's heels in the hallway, and despite the situation, she felt a small smile forming. The lesson about justice her mother had always taught her was about to play out in real time. The law, Judge Johnson would say, is blind, but those who abuse it should see their mistakes coming. Judge Patricia Johnson's entrance into the police station created an immediate hush. She wore her formal black suit, having come directly from court, but it was her presence rather than her attire that commanded attention. Rather than announcing herself, she stood quietly near the entrance, observing the scene before her. Officers Sullivan and Cooper were still standing awkwardly near the booking desk, their earlier confidence replaced by, "Can someone explain?" Judge Johnson finally spoke, her voice carrying across the now silent room, why my minor daughter was arrested without probable cause and denied her constitutional rights. Neither officer immediately responded. Officer Martinez, still at the booking desk, quickly pulled up the incident report on her screen. Your Honor, Sullivan finally managed, his voice notably less authoritative than before. We responded to a shoplifting call at Marlowe's boutique. The suspect was caught with stolen merchandise. The suspect. Judge Johnson interrupted, her eyebrow raising slightly. You mean the honor student who was illegally searched and detained without evidence? The same young woman who requested to view security footage that would have proven her innocence? Cooper stepped forward, attempting damage control. Ma'am, Your Honor, we were following standard procedure for retail theft. Standard procedure. Judge Johnson moved closer, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. Is it standard procedure to deny a minor's request to contact their parent? To refuse to review readily available evidence? To make biased assumptions based on race? The color drained from both officers' faces as Judge Johnson pulled out her phone and played a video. Mrs. Watson's recording from the boutique, which had already been forwarded to the judge's office. I see Officer Sullivan telling the store manager not to check security footage, she continued, her voice getting quieter but more intense. I hear Officer Cooper making discriminatory remarks. I witnessed both of you violating at least 6 departmental procedures and several constitutional rights. Ms. Roberts stepped forward with her notes. I've documented all violations, Your Honor, including their refusal to read Miranda rights, improper handling of a minor, and discrimination under color of authority. The station's captain, Alan Rodriguez, hurried out of his office, having been alerted to the situation. Judge Johnson, I assure you this matter will be thoroughly investigated. It certainly will be, Captain, she interrupted smoothly. Not just by Internal Affairs, but by the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. I'd already spoken with their director. Rebecca watched as her mother methodically dismantled the officers' actions, citing specific laws and precedents they had violated. Other officers in the station had gathered to watch, many taking notes on what not to do in the future. Furthermore, Judge Johnson continued, I received an interesting call from Mrs. Watson, a witness at the boutique. She observed several girls, including Emily Parker, behaving suspiciously around my daughter. I believe the security footage will prove quite enlightening. Sullivan and Cooper exchanged panicked looks, realizing how thoroughly they had mishandled the situation. Their rush to judgment had not only violated procedures, but had now placed them under the scrutiny of one of the most powerful judges in the state. Your Honor, Captain Rodriguez intervened again. Officers Sullivan and Cooper will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. Judge Johnson nodded slightly. That's a start, Captain. Ms. Roberts, please ensure all documentation is properly filed. We'll need copies for the Civil Rights Investigation, the Internal Affairs Review, and of course, the Civilian Oversight Board. Rebecca stood up, gathering her belongings that had been scattered during the illegal search. She watched as Officers Sullivan and Cooper were escorted to the captain's office, their badges and service weapons being surrendered for the duration of the investigation. Mom, Rebecca said quietly, Emily Parker and her friends are probably still at the boutique. The security footage is being secured as we speak. Judge Johnson finished, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. Ms. Roberts has already dispatched a court officer to obtain it. No one will be deleting anything today. As they prepared to leave the station, Judge Johnson turned back to address the remaining officers. Let this be a lesson, she said firmly. Justice isn't about assumptions or prejudices. It's about facts, evidence, and constitutional rights. When you forget that, you dishonor your badge and everything it represents. The doors closed behind them, leaving a station full of officers to contemplate how quickly power dynamics could shift when justice was properly served. The security room at Marlowe's boutique was crowded as Mr. Peterson, the store manager, queued up the footage from earlier that afternoon. Judge Johnson, Ms. Roberts, Captain Rodriguez, and 2 Internal Affairs investigators watched intently as the events unfolded on the multiple screens before them. There's Rebecca entering the store, Mr. Peterson pointed out, his hands shaking slightly as he operated the controls. The timestamp showed 4:47 p.m. The footage clearly showed Rebecca browsing through the clothing racks, occasionally checking price tags and holding items up for a better look. Minutes later, Emily Parker and her friends entered the store, their arrival captured from 3 different camera angles. "Watch the girl in the pink sweater," Ms. Roberts said, indicating Emily. "See how she keeps looking around to check if anyone's watching her." The group watched as Emily deliberately maneuvered behind Rebecca, pretending to browse through nearby items. When Rebecca moved toward the fitting rooms, Emily quickly slipped the silk scarf into the partially open backpack, then walked away as if nothing had happened. "Pause it there," Judge Johnson instructed. "Zoom in on the right corner of the screen." The enhanced image revealed Mrs. Watson in the background, clearly witnessing Emily's actions. Her phone was partially visible in her hands, explaining how she had managed to record part of the incident. Captain Rodriguez shook his head in disgust. "This is a clear case of deliberate framing. The Parker girl needs to be brought in for questioning." "There's more," Mr. Peterson said quietly, fast-forwarding to when the officers arrived. The footage showed Sullivan and Cooper entering the store before any alarm had been triggered, positioning themselves to watch Rebecca. They were waiting for something to happen, one of the internal affairs investigators noted, scribbling in his notebook. This suggests premeditation on their part. The body camera footage from both officers proved even more damning. The audio captured their prejudiced comments and their deliberate dismissal of proper procedure. When Rebecca had requested to see the security footage, Sullivan's camera caught him warning the store clerk not to cooperate. "We've seen enough," Judge Johnson stated firmly. "Mr. Peterson, we'll need copies of all this footage, and I trust you'll be pressing charges against Ms. Parker and her accomplices." The store manager nodded quickly. "Of course, Your Honor. I'm deeply sorry about this incident. If we had checked the footage immediately as requested." "Yes," Judge Johnson agreed. "If you had followed proper protocol, my daughter wouldn't have been subjected to this humiliating experience. We'll be addressing that as well." Ms. Roberts was already preparing documentation for multiple cases: criminal charges against Emily and her friends, civil rights violations against the officers, and a separate complaint about the store's discriminatory practices. Meanwhile, at the Parker residence, Emily sat in her family's expensive living room, still unaware that her actions had been caught on camera. Her phone buzzed with a message from one of her friends. "Did you see? That girl we framed is Judge Johnson's daughter." The color drained from Emily's face as she frantically searched online news sites. Sure enough, local media was already picking up the story of how 2 officers had wrongfully arrested the daughter of the city's most prominent judge. Back at the boutique, Rebecca examined the security footage showing Emily planting the scarf. "Mom," she said thoughtfully, "I want to make sure this doesn't just disappear because of who you are. This happens to people without powerful parents every day." Judge Johnson placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You're right. That's why we're going to handle this by the book. Every violation will be documented, every responsible party will be held accountable, and we'll use this case to push for broader reforms." Captain Rodriguez approached with a preliminary report. "Your Honor, Officers Sullivan and Cooper have a history of similar complaints, but most were dismissed without investigation. We're reopening those cases now." The evidence was undeniable: racial profiling by the officers, deliberate framing by privileged teenagers, and systemic failures that allowed such incidents to occur. What had started as a simple shopping trip was about to become a catalyst for significant changes in how law enforcement handled similar situations. As they left the boutique, Rebecca noticed Mrs. Watson waiting outside. The elderly woman smiled and nodded, knowing her quick thinking in recording the incident had helped expose the truth. Sometimes, justice needed more than just the law. It needed witnesses brave enough to stand up for what was right. The conference room at the Internal Affairs Division was filled with tension as Lieutenant Sarah Martinez spread dozens of case files across the large oak table. Each folder represented a previous complaint against Officers Sullivan and Cooper, dating back over their 5 years on the force. Chief Investigator David Chen rubbed his temples as he reviewed the pattern emerging from the documents. The Rebecca Johnson incident had triggered the most thorough investigation of police misconduct the department had seen in years. "Pull up the surveillance footage from the last 6 months," Chen instructed. A young tech analyst quickly typed commands into his laptop, and the wall screen filled with various clips of Sullivan and Cooper on duty. The footage was damning. In scene after scene, the officers displayed clear bias in their interactions with minorities. They conducted unnecessary stops, performed illegal searches, and showed a consistent pattern of harassment. This goes beyond two rogue officers, Judge Johnson observed from her seat at the table. She had been invited to observe the investigation, given her daughter's involvement and her position on the Judicial Oversight Committee. This represents a systemic failure in training, supervision, and accountability. Ms. Roberts, who had been analyzing complaint statistics, looked up from her laptop. I found something interesting. In 85% of these cases, the supervising officers failed to review available evidence before dismissing the complaints. The room grew quiet as security footage from Marlowe's boutique played again. The clear image of Emily Parker planting the scarf in Rebecca's backpack was followed by Sullivan and Cooper's obviously biased response. "Where are we on the Parker case?" Chen asked, turning to Detective Wilson, who handled juvenile cases. "Emily Parker and her 3 friends have confessed," Wilson reported. "Their parents were less than pleased to learn about potential felony charges. They're willing to cooperate fully in exchange for consideration in sentencing." The investigation had expanded beyond just police misconduct. The store's discriminatory practices were being examined, and several other victims of similar incidents had come forward after hearing Rebecca's story. The store's security logs show a disturbing trend, Martinez added, pulling up another file. Over 80% of their shoplifting accusations in the past year targeted minority customers. Most cases were dismissed once evidence was properly reviewed. Rebecca, who had been invited to provide her statement again, sat quietly beside her mother. She had spent hours reviewing photos of other potential victims, identifying patterns that might have been missed. "What about Sullivan and Cooper's previous partners?" Chen asked, flipping through more reports. "Have we interviewed them?" Martinez nodded. 3 former partners have come forward. They'd all requested transfers after witnessing concerning behavior. One even filed a formal complaint that was mysteriously lost in the system. The investigation was revealing layers of institutional problems. It wasn't just about 2 officers or 1 incident anymore. It was about a culture that allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked. "We need to address this at every level," Judge Johnson stated firmly. "From academy training to supervision protocols, from complaint procedures to accountability measures." The tech analyst raised his hand. "Sir, we've finished analyzing the officer's body camera footage from the past 3 months. The AA flagged 147 potentially biased interactions." Chen stood up, walking to the evidence board where photos, documents, and timelines covered every inch of space. "This isn't just an investigation anymore," he declared. "This is going to be a complete overhaul of how we handle these situations." Rebecca watched as the adults in the room discussed policy changes, training reforms, and accountability measures. Her mother had been right. Sometimes it took one incident to expose much deeper problems. "The commissioner wants daily updates," Martinez reminded everyone. "The media attention on this case has put enormous pressure on the department to demonstrate real change." As the meeting concluded, Judge Johnson and Rebecca gathered their belongings. The investigation was far from over, but it was already clear that its impact would extend far beyond the original incident at Marlowe's boutique. "Mom," Rebecca said as they walked to the car, "do you think this will really change anything?" Judge Johnson smiled at her daughter. "Change happens when people are brave enough to stand up and smart enough to document everything. You did both. Now it's our job to make sure this leads to real reforms, not just promises." The internal investigation was revealing uncomfortable truths, but sometimes that was exactly what was needed to create meaningful change. The police department's main conference room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as Commissioner Barnes approached the podium. After 6 weeks of intensive investigation, it was time to announce the findings and consequences of the Rebecca Johnson case. "Good morning," the commissioner began, his face grave. "Today, we're announcing sweeping changes in response to serious misconduct discovered during our recent internal investigation. Officers James Cooper and Mike Sullivan have been terminated from the force, effective immediately." Additionally, Barnes continued, 3 supervising officers have been demoted for failing to properly investigate previous complaints. The department will reopen all cases involving Officers Sullivan and Cooper from the past 5 years for thorough review. The announcement turned to specific policy changes. Every officer would now wear body cameras that couldn't be turned off during interactions with the public. A civilian oversight board would review all complaints of bias or misconduct. Mandatory bias training would be conducted quarterly instead of annually. In the back of the room, Emily Parker and her parents listened as the commissioner detailed the consequences for false reporting and deliberate framing. The teenager's face was pale as she heard her name mentioned in connection with the criminal charges she now faced. The Parker case will be handled through juvenile court, Barnes explained, but make no mistake, attempting to frame an innocent person for theft is a serious crime, regardless of the perpetrator's age. Mr. Peterson, the store manager from Marlowe's boutique, shifted uncomfortably in his seat as attention turned to the store's role in the incident. The company had agreed to a substantial settlement and mandatory changes to their security practices. Marlowe's boutique will implement new anti-bias training for all employees, Barnes announced. They will also install a more sophisticated security system that automatically records all interactions, protecting both customers and staff from false accusations. Judge Johnson stood to address the room, her presence commanding immediate attention. This case exposed systemic problems that go beyond individual actions, she stated. The reforms announced today are just the beginning. We're establishing a permanent task force to monitor implementation and continue pushing for necessary changes. The task force would include civil rights attorneys, community leaders, law enforcement officials, and citizens who had experienced similar discrimination. Rebecca had been invited to serve as a youth representative, giving voice to younger victims of profiling. Emily Parker was called forward to make a public apology. Her voice trembled as she faced the cameras. "What I did was wrong," she admitted. "I let prejudice and privilege guide my actions, and I almost ruined someone's life because of it. I'm sorry, Rebecca." As part of her rehabilitation, Emily would spend the next year working with anti-bias youth programs, sharing her story as a warning about the consequences of prejudice and false accusations. Chief Investigator Chen presented the statistical findings of their review. "We discovered a pattern of biased enforcement that went unchecked for years," he explained. "Our new oversight measures will ensure this pattern cannot repeat itself." The changes weren't limited to the local level. State lawmakers had taken notice, and new legislation was being drafted to address similar issues across the state. Rebecca's case had become a catalyst for broader reform. "Let this be a lesson," Commissioner Barnes concluded. "Justice requires vigilance, accountability, and the courage to admit when systems have failed. We're committed to earning back the public's trust through actions, not just words." After the press conference, Rebecca spoke quietly with Mrs. Watson, whose quick thinking in recording the original incident had provided crucial evidence. The elderly woman had been hired as a community liaison for the new oversight board, ensuring that citizen witnesses would have a voice in future investigations. "You handled this with such grace," Mrs. Watson told Rebecca. "You turned a terrible experience into an opportunity for real change." Judge Johnson watched her daughter with pride as reporters gathered to ask final questions. The case had been difficult for Rebecca, but she had emerged stronger, more determined to fight for justice. As the crowd dispersed, Emily approached Rebecca one last time. "I've learned so much from this," she said softly. "Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like." Rebecca nodded, knowing that true accountability wasn't just about punishment. It was about learning, changing, and working to prevent future injustices. The reforms announced today weren't perfect, but they were a significant step toward a fairer system for everyone. 1 year after the incident at Marlowe's boutique, Rebecca Johnson stood at a podium in the City Hall auditorium, addressing a crowd of students, community leaders, and law enforcement officials. The Youth Justice Alliance she had founded was celebrating its first anniversary. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Rebecca began, her voice strong and clear. "But when we stand together and demand accountability, real transformation is possible. In the past year, our city has shown what that transformation can look like." The statistics displayed on the screen behind her told a compelling story. Complaints of racial profiling had decreased by 60%. The new oversight board had successfully resolved dozens of cases. Police training programs have been completely redesigned with community input. In the audience, Emily Parker sat with a group of high school students she now mentored. Her own experience had led her to become an advocate for anti-bias education in schools. The former mean girl had found a new purpose in helping others understand the impact of their prejudices. Today, we're launching our peer support network, Rebecca announced. Students from every high school in the city will be trained to recognize and report discrimination. They'll learn their rights and help others stand up against injustice. Judge Patricia Johnson watched from the side of the stage, remembering how her daughter had turned a traumatic experience into a movement for change. The judge had used her position to support reform, but it was Rebecca's vision that had truly connected with young people. Mrs. Watson, now the head of the Civilian Oversight Board, stood to share her perspective. When I recorded those officers that day, I never imagined it would lead to all this, she said, gesturing to the packed auditorium. But it shows that one person speaking up can start a revolution. The former store manager, Mr. Peterson, had become an unlikely ally. After the incident, he had worked with Rebecca to develop new retail training programs that helped staff recognize and overcome their unconscious biases. Marlowe's boutique was now a model for inclusive shopping environments. Our next initiative, Rebecca continued, is the creation of a youth legal clinic. Working with volunteer lawyers, we'll provide free advice to young people facing discrimination. No one should feel powerless when their rights are violated. Chief Investigator Chen, who had led the original investigation, provided an update on the department's reforms. The new policies had become a blueprint for other cities struggling with similar issues. Police academies across the state now included the Rebecca Johnson case in their training materials. Emily stepped up to the microphone to share her story. A year ago, I was part of the problem, she admitted. Today, I'm working to be part of the solution. Our prejudices can blind us, but we can learn to see clearly if we're willing to change. The Youth Justice Alliance had grown beyond its original mission. It now offered workshops on civil rights, leadership training for young activists, and support groups for victims of discrimination. Students from other cities were starting their own chapters. But our work isn't finished, Rebecca reminded the audience. Every day, someone faces unfair treatment because of how they look or where they come from. Our job is to keep fighting until that's no longer true. Judge Johnson joined her daughter on stage for the closing remarks. Together, they had created a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in civil rights law. The first recipients would be announced that evening. My daughter taught me something important, the judge said, smiling at Rebecca. Justice isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about changing hearts and minds, about helping people understand why those laws matter. As the ceremony ended, Rebecca looked out at the faces in the crowd. There were former victims who had found their voice, reform bullies who had learned empathy, and young activists ready to carry the work forward. The incident that could have broken her spirit had instead sparked a movement. Mrs. Watson approached with a group of new volunteers. Ready to start training the next generation? She asked with a warm smile. Rebecca nodded, gathering her materials for the workshop. The past year had shown her that lasting change required both bold action and patient education. It meant holding people accountable while giving them the chance to learn and grow. As she watched the students file into the training room, Rebecca felt hopeful. The world wasn't perfect, but it was changing, one person at a time, and she would keep working until every young person knew they had the power to stand up, speak out, and make a difference.